Hello and welcome to Red May. I'm Sean Landis. I'm here with Mahim Lakhani. We are bringing you a midnight special event today. Well, it's more of an after midnight special. It's currently 3 a.m. here in Seattle. We've got a really special group of people joining us tonight from all over the globe. We're here to discuss the broader themes around the long-awaited and highly anticipated new book from Rodrigo Nunez, Neither Vertical Nor Horizontal, just out this week from Verso Books. But before we introduce our guests for tonight, I've got to make a pitch. If you enjoy Red May's programming and want to support us, there are a few ways to do that. Red May is entirely volunteer run and donation funded. If you are interested in joining up and participating, feel free to contact us over at our website, redmayseattle.org. Likewise, you can send us some money with a one-time donation at our GoFundMe or become a monthly subscriber to our Patreon. Both links are available in the description below. While you're down there, give this video a like and subscribe to Red May TV on YouTube. Help us continue to organize and to bring contemporary communist and socialist perspectives, analyses, and arts right to you and yours. Joining us tonight for our discussion of Neither Vertical Nor Horizontal, we have Rodrigo Nunez, Camille Barbagallo, Paulo Gerbato, Richard Seymour, and Daniel Gutierrez. Camille is a feminist activist, researcher, and organizer with the Women's Strike Assembly. She's the editor of Women and the Subversion of the Community, Maria Rosa Della Costa Reader, and co-editor of Commoning with George Kafensis and Silvia Federici. She's currently working on supporting climate justice movements and is the COP26 Coalition Coordinator. Paulo Gerbato is a sociologist and political theorist. He is the author of The Mask and the Flag, Digital Party, and the forthcoming The Great Recoil, Politics After Populism and Pandemic. Richard Seymour is an author and editor based in London. He is the author of The Twittering Machine and Corbyn, The Strange Rebirth of Radical Politics, Against Austerity, and several other great works. Richard is a founding editor of the journal Salvage, and his writing can be found in The Guardian, The New York Times, and various outlets, including his Patreon, of which I am a subscriber. Man of the Hour, we have Rodrigo Nunez. Rodrigo is a philosopher, organizer, and educator. He is the author of Organization of the Organization Less, Collective Action After Networks, and Neither Vertical Nor Horizontal, a theory of political organization. You can find Rodrigo's writing in places like The Guardian, Al Jazeera, Radical Philosophy, Crisis and Critique, Viewpoint Magazine, and South Atlantic Quarterly. As an organizer and popular educator, Rodrigo has been involved in several political initiatives over the years, including the first editions of the World Social Forum and Justice for Cleaners campaign in London. And last but not least, we have our moderator, probably one of the busiest people you'll ever meet. Daniel Gutierrez is a member of Die Linke, a co-founder of Werkstatt, and a co-host of the Spadework podcast. Daniel is a doctoral candidate at the Freie Universität Berlin, and his research focuses on worker organization, power, and strategy. Daniel, take it away.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate the intro and the invitation to be here. It's quite an honor to be virtually sitting here with all these lovely speakers. Thank you all. So yeah, it's a really interesting book. As we just went over, it's pretty anticipated. I'm really excited to have this conversation because I got a copy of Rodrigo's manuscript quite some time ago, and have been jonesing to talk to other people about it. So let's get to it. Rodrigo, your book uses this important framing device around the idea of the threat posed by climate change in order to help us kind of focus the mind on the question of organization today, and the limits that movements have encountered to this day. because the single most important organizational task that the left or humankind as a whole has is averting climate catastrophe. And this way, we have a clear kind of political objective, right? Reduce global climate emissions by 50%, according to 2010 levels, by 2030, according to the IPCC 2018 special report, right? That is the political effect that the left has to achieve. The problem then is how to organize our collective resources, our potentia, in time to do this. Starting from this problem, the book proposes that we review the last 10, 20 years of social movement history in order to find what in the global experience of that period can help us kind of solve this problem. I would like to start this discussion with Camille and Rodrigo. The two of you lived through both the alter globalization or global justice movement and the uprisings of the early 2010s. Can you tell us about some of the organizational doxa that informed political action throughout that period, and what you think the final balance sheet of these practices were, and ideas? Thanks.
Firstly, thank you so much for the invitation to join this discussion. I'm hoping that Rodrigo might kick us off on this discussion in terms of, we didn't arrange who would go first, but if you kick us off, I've been thinking about our youth all morning, so I've got some stuff to say.
Well, then you go ahead.
Ha ha ha, comrade. All right, so it was a while ago, and I had to kind of confront how long I've been hanging out in the left. I think in the first original draft of these questions, we were described as veterans, which produced a full-on existential crisis for me in the last 24 hours. But in a more serious note, thinking back to the kind of politics that I was involved in like the late 90s and early 2000s, and kind of talking with a few other people who were also involved in what we used to call the anti-globalization movement. I think here in the UK, it was the alter globalization movement. I was based in Australia at the time, which I think has a particular post-colonial kind of context. But certainly in ways that we haven't quite seen since then, there was a real sense, like, being in Australia, that we were part of a global movement, operating within kind of national and kind of local contexts. I suppose one of the main kind of ideas that I can remember from that period was the kind of politics around convergence, and that we were looking to kind of coordinate groups, really disparate groups and different groups, through a process of convergence without unity necessarily. And I suppose within the Australian context, and I'd be interested to hear about your experiences, Rodrigo, where you were based, there wasn't one political actor in Australia that could have cohered or driven that process. And so that lack of one dominant kind of actor definitely led to a whole series of kind of questions around how to bring people together, and through what kinds of forms and processes. And I suppose reading through bits of your book, I think I saw bits of the past in there, in terms of like there really was this ecology of the left in the late 90s, in terms of we were working across a spectrum of politics, in terms of working with socialist organizations, working with radical social democrats, and working with people who probably at that point self-identified as anarchists. Though I would say one reflection would be that a lot of our kind of non-hierarchical desires that were kind of emulated in things like spokes councils and affinity groups were very much about bringing together representatives from groups. And one of the main differences I was thinking about this morning was that this cult of the celebrity or cult of the individual kind of activists that we see now just didn't have the same purchase, in that I remember Naomi Klein getting so much grief because she was this individual. And I wonder that's like something that's really kind of stark and different to now. But maybe I'll kick it over to you to see if you had if that's like kind of sparked any kind of, meanderings down nostalgic lane, and then I can pick back up.
No, that was definitely a great Madeleine. Well, yeah, I would agree. Like generally, the things that Cam raised about like that being a kind of politics that was very much event based and through events convergence based, and the ideas of horizontality and leaderlessness, which actually appear or become a major theme for movements for the first time there in the turn of the century with the outer globalization movement. Those are definitely the things that are common to what we had later in the early 2010s, with this one important difference that Camille pointed out, which is there is a completely different media landscape between the two moments. I mean, you had, Indie Media's slogan at the turn of the century was "Be the Media," and by the early 2010s, in a way, everyone was, because of the rise of social media platforms like Facebook and Twitter, which actually meant that, as Cam pointed out, there was a much greater individualization of the figure of the activist and the appearance of like individual activist brands. But this idea of climate change as being something that helps us focus the mind on the problem of organization has to do very specifically with the problem of temporal finitude that climate change poses, i.e. the fact that according to our best knowledge today, we have a finite amount of time and fairly short amount of time to act so as to avoid even worse effects than the ones that we're already guaranteed to have, and obviously all the human cost, the human and non-human cost that we'll have, and the gigantic impacts on the social reproduction of humankind as a whole. And I think that is relevant because it also, this element of finitude is also relevant because it responds in a way to something that I guess was a kind of underlying philosophy in the outer globalization movement, which I think was still, perhaps not in an entirely reflected way, was still active in the early 2010s, which was, on the one hand, everyone criticized Marxism, or at least certain strains of Marxism, for being teleological, for believing in some sort of unilinear march of history. But there was still some form of teleological thinking at work there, in both in the outer globalization movement and in the early 2010s, I think. In the sense that there was like this hope that, well, we don't need to pose certain problems. We don't need to pose the problem of the state. We don't need to pose the problem of organizing at higher levels or organizing at bigger scale, because it may just be that doing what we're doing, things will eventually click together. And that was sustained by a somewhat biased recourse to the discourse in the natural sciences about self-organization, which was both somewhat biased and perhaps quite literal in the sense that I think I hear the little ones in the background. And the literal in the sense that like people took descriptions of the functioning of ant colonies and imagined, well, maybe the movement to destroy global capitalism is like an ant colony in the sense that, you know, just individuals doing their own thing can click together in a way that produces the end of capitalism. And I think one of the things that has changed since the 2010s is people realized there is a strong element of wishful thinking in that, and climate change doesn't really allow us to indulge in that sort of wishful thinking now, because sure, it may well be that things could just click together from the actions of individuals or the actions of very small local initiatives, but we don't have the time. And so we need to pose the problem of organization at different scales without that meaning necessarily leaving behind some of the questions that people were posing when they raised horizontality as like a goal and a value on which to live by. But still, we can't afford to ignore these questions that could be pushed to one side with recourse to this kind of soft, conditional teleology. On the other hand, once we raise the problem of scale again, then we return to the other thing that appeared as a question around the turn of the century with the outer globalization movement, and I think has returned now very strongly, which is thinking of movements as an ecology. And well, if you pose the problem of organization in ecological terms, which is what I've tried to do in this book, the question then becomes, how do you make the most out of the ecology you have, and how do you develop not a party, not a single organization, but an ecology that is up to the kind of task that we have today?
And I think, so one of the things that I think is also useful to think through in terms of like what was learned and what wasn't learned is to think about what some of those external conditions were that were leading some of those organizational questions in the late 90s. So for us in Australia, and I think this is quite different to other kind of national contexts, is that the student movement played a really key role and was an incredible, and brought with it a whole series of questions around factionalism and resources and institutional power that necessarily informed some of the structures that we were building. And also our relationship to Trotskyist organizations was also really a part of what those convergent spaces were informed by. In terms of coming back to this question, Rodrigo, that you were raising in terms of how do we make the most of the ecologies of our movements, right? Like, so, and how do we lean into the strengths of what a diverse and vibrant bio kind of ecology of the left looks like, and then how, if that's the thing that we're trying to nurture and we think has hope and horizons within it, how there are processes that are totally destructive and that can totally destabilize that kind of form of politics. And I think then through processes of being undermined, because I wanted to kind of be as self-reflexive about our kind of side of the debate as possible, because I think that's what's most useful when we look back on history. And I think one of the things that I would say is that, and one of the legacies that's not as good, is a prioritization of process over politics that I think we've inherited from that era, and that continues to dominate the left in a variety of different ways. And I think that comes from part of one of the weaknesses of this kind of situating and formation of politics as an ecology, when there isn't necessarily a consensus based, like where there isn't actually a lived and meaningful kind of consensus across the broader ecology.
Thank you, the two of you. That's a really good point, Camille, and it segues perfectly with the next question. From here, I'd like to pass the mic over to Paulo and Richard in order to talk about the jump to parties in the digital age. What have been the problems precisely with this kind of participatory and proceduralism of the digital party? Like, do we see any kind of relation between that kind of street movement proceduralism and the kind of proceduralism that goes into new digital parties? What have been the dangers of imagining electoral power without the infrastructural work of base building and the phenomena of political exchange happening so much over digital means? For example, Richard, you've highlighted some of the problems facing internal divisions within the working class in the UK as evidence with the Corbyn campaign. Younger generations of intellectual and service workers, many of which have, of course, through the academy, formed the iron core of Corbynism. However, the Corbyn campaign was unable to form any kind of or broad, meaningful connections to deindustrialized workers in Northern England, particularly of the old Fordist generation. When I was in England shortly before the elections, comrades had complained that many of the voters had a difficult time believing anything credible out of Labour, precisely because Labour had historically or currently been in their local councils operating as agents of neoliberalism. So how can we overcome those dynamics or think through them? And can digital parties, or the shift to organizing according to what Rodrigo describes in the book as a platform the platform logic, do this on its own? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does.
Cool.
Okay, briskly then. I'm not going to dismiss the idea of the platform logic, but I do want to highlight from the start that I think the idea of the digital party works far better for right-wing adventurers than it does for the left, because by and large these parties work negatively by disruption, in that they exploit weakness and slowness in lumbering, stalemated parliamentary systems. They manipulate surges of attention. They can game the polls, they game the media, they use it to achieve very short-term, narrow-focused policy goals or results. So I have in mind the Brexit Party in 2019, which wasn't really a party, strongly influenced by the Five Star Movement and Casaleggio associates, with whom Farage was in close contact, and set up with a sort of classical digital party structure, no real democratic deliberative procedures in place at all, no real membership structure, and no manifesto or policy statement. Everything invested in a corporate leadership, of which Nigel Farage was CEO, could only be removed by a vote of a board appointed by him. And so they set up a digital infrastructure to extract donations and free digital labor from supporters. And then they organized this motivational speaking tour by Farage to rally the Gammon roots with rock music and charismatic rage. And this, what this did, what it accomplished, is to exploit and catalyze divisions within the Conservative Party over Brexit and a cluster of related issues, exploit the media's underlying susceptibility to the far right's narratives. And that's sufficient to throw a decrepit UK Parliament into a moment of turmoil. And of course, Johnson became prime minister on the strength of that. And we would not have seen the hard Brexit he wanted delivered necessarily. And perhaps the election result would have been different too. So this was a political success. It drove British politics further to the right on the basis of a single totemic goal. But in fact, in general, Jen Schrady's work on digital activism demonstrates that, if you're talking about whom this type of activity favors, generally speaking, it favors small, well-organized, well-funded networks of conservatives with a largely deferential mobilizing base. So that's not something, by the way, that means that we can dismiss this. I'm just saying that we should be aware of how it strategically selects for certain types of goals. What digital parties and platforms and digital activism are not very good at is any kind of political change that requires concentrating on articulating mass agendas, summoning and giving form to broad social forces, building cadres and trading activists with sufficient tenacity to fight through prolonged political downturns, or to engage people in a participatory way that doesn't simply degenerate into manipulated plebiscites. And I think if you look at the Brexit Party, and I think Paolo will confirm if this is true of also the Five Star Movement, it was very good at assembling sizable votes out of bits and pieces, slithers of social classes and demographics here and there, all pooled together by the online logic of aggregation. But when it came to fighting for constituency seats, they struggled. And the reason is that they lacked the geographical depth, the community rootedness through which to get out the vote. And I think we could imagine this in terms of our own goals if we were to try something like this, in terms of a distinction between simple and complex contagions. So a simple contagion is one that spreads through the weakest social ties, a bit like COVID, or like an online trending topic, a very superficial fad or whatever it happens to be. Doesn't have very high thresholds of uptake, so it spreads quickly. A complex contagion is one that has higher thresholds of uptakes, like a social movement, like civil rights, like the Paris Commune. And if you're going to join a social movement, sometimes you need to see several friends and relatives approve of it first. And historically, that's why social movements tend to spread fastest through precisely the sorts of tightly knit residential communities that would slow a simple contagion spread because of the amount of network redundancy contained within it. So the cyber wars of the neo-nationalist right offer us some methodological principles, some of them negative. But to complicate this, obviously the breakthrough of the New Left in the UK and its ability to take over the Labour Party, despite its historical organised weakness, relied precisely on its investment in some of those techniques. A lot of mobilisation, enthusiasm, and hustle, but most of it without a thick civic or democratic structure at all. So essentially, again, it exploited the decay of a party system and of the control held by a bureaucratic layer in it. And that's probably among the reasons why it then struggled to achieve democratizing goals, because, the majority who were won over to this experiment were largely passive, mobilizing only, to defend the leadership, a charismatic leader or anti-charismatic leader in this case. And that, to engage with iterations of Rodrigo's specific conceptualization of the platform. For example, when Momentum sets up an app or a tool designed by a few people in the office to fight for policy proposals at Labour conference or whatever, without their being fundamentally included in decision making. And that, of course, achieves some results, but the fragility of it all can be seen in the way that under Starmer, the new leader of the right has recaptured most of the apparatuses and embarked upon a purge. So I would say that in terms of an ecology, and I very much appreciate this way of phrasing the problem, putting it in ecological terms. In terms of an ecology, we might want to be aware that certain organizing possibilities that are available out there, particularly those that favor thin civic engagement, weak social ties, probably are structurally geared against the left. We might just want to be aware of that.
All right, should I follow? I was waiting for an introductory question, but I'll just follow from that. I agree with many things that Richard said. I disagree with others, and I'll try to elaborate that a bit. I mean, I think the first thing is what for me is the useful contribution of Rodrigo's work, namely to introduce a kind of ecological perspective to the study of organizations, which goes against a tendency in sociology and political science to study organizations as if they were self-standing structures, autonomous from everything else, and to be studied in isolation. I think this is particularly the case in a certain stream of political science, where really this is very kind of abstract analysis of organizations. And obviously, organizations can never be studied in isolation. I think in that regard is useful to remember Gramsci's discussion of the political party in The Modern Prince, where he says that the study of a political party always entails the study of the society, right, it emerges from. Or in Rodrigo's words, the study of an organization always requires the study of the context, of the ecology it emerges from. Because organizations are can only be understood in relation to the broader environment in which they emerge. Here, Rodrigo, in the book, refers to the idea of area as it was used in the Autonomia, in Italian Marxist Autonomia, namely the idea that movements were part of a broader assemblage, right, made of factories, schools, neighborhoods, various movements, self-help groups, parties, and so on and so forth. And actually, this relational perspective is fundamental for political strategy, because otherwise it is very difficult for a single organization to decide how to chart its path if it ignores, right, the broader environment it operates within. An example of that, I mean, it is impossible to understand, for example, Podemos, if we don't understand the Indignados movement. I mean, Podemos was enabled by the presence of an ecology of what in Spain they call the social muscle, right, that was created by the Indignados movement. Anyone who may want to attempt the Podemos experiment elsewhere, where those ecological conditions are not in place, will obviously fail because the fundamental preconditions are missing there. So that raises important questions about the relation of political organization to society at large, to other organizations, and the relationship between leadership, right, and the base of the movement, what Rodrigo refers to as the vanguard function, which I think is really fundamental, because indeed, in a way, the activists we see now at the helm of new movements and parties, many of them are people who were brought up politically in the late 90s, early 90s, including Pablo Iglesias, right, who was in the anti-globalization movement. And the fact that some of them turned to parties was precisely in a way as a result of their growing worry of some of the limits of horizontal organizing, and trying to mediate that kind of libertarian impulse, should we call it, or anti-authoritarian impulse, with more pragmatic concerns. And indeed, I think that wherever we look at any movement and parties, we will always find vanguards. I mean, for how much they may pretend to be horizontal, there's always kind of minority of people that tends to have the initiative. This is something that is almost down to something about kind of human nature, really. I mean, as theorists perhaps were right in pointing out. And there was actually a point that Gramsci was taken from elite theories. I mean, to conclude, I think just to respond to one of Richard's remarks, I think that, I mean, I see your point when you say that weak ties can militate against, or a strategy focusing on weak ties can militate against the left and for more the right. But I'd also say that very wide, broad-based movements will necessarily mobilize weak ties as the majority of ties, say, they mobilize, because the kind of core group of militant activists will always be a minority, right? I mean, the kind of party of cadres will always be a minority. So the question of political organization, and this is really kind of connected to the ecological point made by Rodrigo in the book, is really how you manage to, at the same time, constitute a cohesive, militant, well-organized activist core, but one that is also able really to kind of permeate society to construct networks in society so as to be able to mobilize people who are less committed, yet maybe sympathizing for a given cause.
Thank you for that input. Camille, a different version of the same problem in terms of decay and ossification of Fordist organizations can also be found in the difficulty many workers face with unions nearly everywhere. On the one hand, there's been some difficulty for unions to make inroads into new working class spaces in the service, platform, and tech sectors. For example, this ability to create this kind of network connectivity into these kind of social bases is particularly difficult, to put in other words. On the other hand, the process of neoliberalization also spelled decay and rot within many unions as bosses up and down the rank and files fell into the pockets of neoliberal politicos. How can we think beyond and still think together the problem of traditional organs of the working class alongside the organization of new bases and non-traditional bases together with these old bases, right? How can we think of, do you think that Rodrigo's idea of strategic wagers around transversal issues centering on social reproduction, housing, public utilities, debt, etc., can offer some new light here?
Yeah, certainly. I think that this question around social reproduction has been most successfully posed by the feminist movement in the last kind of 10 years. And I think that in posing that question, the feminist movement, and by which I mean, obviously, the feminist movement that's being led by our Latin American sisters and that has kind of expanded and grown across the globe, most kind of encapsulated by the International Women's Strike and the continued insistence on moving between both waged and unwaged forms of labor, offers us some of and kind of like when I was thinking about Rodrigo's concept around the transversal kind of wager around social reproduction, I see and hear that within the international feminist movement that I'm a part of. And I think that how we have started to, like, fundamentally, if we're thinking about this question of climate change is fundamentally a question of social reproduction. And I think that this helps us understand where the fight for climate change needs to happen, and what is the climate, and what is changing. And also that and just how bad a shape we're in terms of the traditional trade union movement, I think is really obvious to anyone who's kind of paying any attention to trying to organize and increase class power at the moment. Certainly in our experiences here in the UK, in terms of the women's movement, we've started to articulate our feminist politics along an axis of both the industrial and the political. And so taking something like childcare here in the UK would be a really classic example of, I think, some of what you're talking about in terms of we've got a totally ununionized workforce, not exactly not a new workforce, but definitely the size of the childcare industry has fundamentally expanded as we've seen more working class women being drawn into the labor market as a result of kind of new labor's fascination and dedication of kind of building that boom on the back of working class women's labor that began in the kind of 90s. And I think that where this kind of focus on social reproduction, I think needs to lead us to is a question around the relationship between our industrial struggles of what remains of waged work and how we can struggle around questions of the social wage. And that fundamentally, I think that this question of work, like, you know, if we continually bring this discussion back to climate change, I think it's a really important provocation to think that our struggles around the climate apocalypse or the climate emergency, however you want to think about it, is fundamentally a struggle around work. And it's one in which the fundamental division that maintains capitalist social relations of the kind of separation of production and reproduction is fundamentally that division, and that violence of that separation is fundamentally the relation that's driving so many of the climactic and ecological kind of positions that we face. And so so in many instances where we still find some trade union power, we find them often, I think you could say, in industries where a very clear question, if we are to decarbonize in the process and in the speed and urgency in which now the science is pretty much unanimous, those processes of decarbonization need to happen in industries where we still find some traditional trade union power. And those industries, I've started to see slogans like care work is the greenest work. And that may be true, but also at the moment, it's kind of the shittest, most devalued work. So I think that in thinking through this question of climate change in relation to work and in relation to power, and what needs to be transitioned out of and what needs to be invested in, we need to really be paying attention to how to build new forms. And I think it's an inside-outside, a strategy, as much like the question of climate change means that, as Rodrigo was talking about earlier, we're on the clock in terms of time. And so we don't have the luxury to kind of imagine that we could rebuild the trade union movement in the images that we think it should be. But at the same time, we don't have the time to wait to be kind of disappointed in the blokes who kind of won't let go of power in the way that they've been able to concentrate it. So I think that there are a whole variety of initiatives, particularly in the UK. We've seen a shift to base unionism and base building at the same time as continuing to have the arguments within the larger trade union movement. And at the same time, I think it's not just about building new unions, but about building a relationship to how we struggle around work. And who is excluded from work, and who, and in the ways that recognizes some of the fundamental errors of the last 150 years, which is that the question around social reproduction is one that fundamentally cannot be divorced from our industrial struggles. Like, time and time again, we know historically and currently that if we are able to amass resources outside of the wage, then that only strengthens our kind of class position in relation to our industrial struggles. Thanks.
Thank you. I want to jump over to the last couple of years and some of the big protests that we've seen in different parts of the world. Much of the global north was recently rocked by anti-racist and anti-carceral insurrections following the murder of George Floyd. This seemed to be the perfect example in which many smaller collective organizations and a few larger organizations had been doing the kind of spade work of day-to-day organizing for years, especially before 2014, but since 2014, and like between these kind of interruptions of 2014 and 2016, 2016 and 2020. Sowing seeds that contributed to this explosion of spontaneity that mobilized numbers far beyond the ranks and files of these particular organizations, right? At the same time, there were criticisms in the US that were levied against, for example, DSA for not taking a leading role in this insurrection, as if to prove a non-vanguard capacity that was meant to discredit its potential as a vehicle of legitimate political combat. I found this troubling on multiple grounds, but mostly because why does any organization have to be the bleeding edge of each struggle across all terrains? This seems to be an impossible task given the many terrains of struggle. their local composition, and the limited resource of organizations at this point in the broader process of recomposition. At a personal level, the groundwork DSA contributed to around the Bernie campaign helped many previously non-politicized friends of mine back home become politicized over the last 5 years. Friends who, through this process, also joined on the streets to demand that Black Lives Matter, only to be hit by police clubs, deepening and hardening a process of political resubjectivization. At the same time, that cycle showed us the limits of the power of mobilization, precisely because while this did produce changes precisely without the need of mass organization, all of the changes happening were being controlled by political enemies, some of which turned in our favor, but only in the slightest of ways, but many of the others turned against us. I want to counterpose this experience with the process in Chile, where you have a process of political subjectivization of students going back to the mid-2000s, who, as they aged, kept building infrastructures, unions, bookshops, presses, extra-parliamentary political organizations, and electoral parties, etc., deeply and broadly connecting that beyond that base. Indeed, when I spoke to a comrade in 2016, he had said that the main focus of his party and others were to develop connections like with farmers and miners beyond the urban basis. Back in 2014, Chilean feminists had explained to me a process long underway between feminist organizations and dock workers. So it would make sense to me that when suddenly these kids started hopping turnstiles in 2019, and then the government reacted against that in the form of sending in the military, that what followed was an explosion that we haven't seen, that was pretty much a general strike, right? Like first you had the schools on strike, and then that spread into taxi workers, that spread into bus drivers, that spread into dock workers, and so forth, right? Resulting then in the culmination of the government, and then resulting in the electoral victory for a new kind of constituent process in Chile around the constitution. So, Rodrigo, one constant in your work has been to an attempt to both critique and pose again the idea of vanguard. How does this work? How does your work speak to these two examples? And then after that, if someone wants to chime in, please feel free.
Well, I think this also illustrates some of the stuff that Richard and Paolo were talking about, and again what Camille was talking about just now. I mean, in relation to this idea of the vanguard, so the book is bookended by two references to Wittgenstein, which are a bit fortuitous in the sense that I happened to be, at the time when I was finishing the last big round of revisions on the book, I was working on translating a book that's mostly on Wittgenstein. And then I realized that there was something in common between what I was trying to do and Wittgenstein's idea of linguistic therapy. I was also trying to do some kind of linguistic or conceptual therapy around some concepts or some ways of using concepts that had become so loaded with associations over time that discussions tended to take place around these associations rather than the problems that those concepts tried to address, and their usefulness or non-usefulness in different contexts. And leadership was definitely one of these examples, and I think that is actually something. Thinking about leadership is probably something that I have in common, that I also have in common with Paolo and with Richard. And leadership is definitely a symptom of something in recent, definitely at the start of the 2010s, it was a symptom of something, in the sense that it was this thing that people would define themselves by. We are leaderless. And at the same time, it was very often pretty obvious to any more attentive observer that leaderlessness was a form of disavowal, of not talking about the forms of leadership that were present there. And obviously the idea, thinking through that, thinking, well, what does this concept really mean, and trying to find the most minimal sense of the idea of leadership, which is, to lead is no more than to be followed. It doesn't involve necessarily any other implications. That takes us back to this question of, on the one hand, the groundwork that often goes unrecognized in these explosions. So people, even very often activists, tend to narrate the stories of these huge explosions like we've had in the US recently, or in Chile, in the same way, ironically, in the same way that the press tends to describe them, as these things that come out of nowhere with no preparatory work of any kind. And at the same time, the idea of vanguard generates, I guess, both the kind of demand that you exemplified with this discussion around the role of the TSA, i.e., are they the vanguard? Is this organization the vanguard? But also, on the other hand, the accusation when an organization is seen to be trying to take a leading role, that, oh, these guys, they want to be the vanguard. And the way in which I've tried to rethink this question was by shedding the metaphysical baggage of a philosophy of history that used to come with the concept, that came originally with the concept of vanguard, which was the idea that there could be an organization or a group of leading cadre who would, like you said, who would know the course of history in general, and therefore could be the cutting edge in every struggle, or would know what to do in every struggle. And with that, obviously, a certain mode of, and that idea that, someone somewhere could know the course of history, and those people would be the vanguard, evidently justified a certain mode of organization that legitimized these people in advance, forcing their decisions upon anyone else who didn't know the course of history, who didn't understand the course of history as well as they did. Once you shed this baggage, the problem becomes, well, clearly movements need initiative. Clearly movements need these groups who are going to do that kind of preparatory work that only becomes visible when it does in these unique explosions that we have from time to time. So clearly, something that used to go by the name of vanguard is still a necessity for movements, and it's an absolutely necessary function in an ecology. The problem then is, how do you get vanguards without vanguardism, without the kinds of practices that were historically associated with this way of understanding vanguards, that that has rightfully come under critique from pretty much all quarters, but still is the main association in people's heads today when they talk about vanguards. And in a way, if you try to think vanguard without this baggage, then it pretty much becomes the converse, the other side of thinking organization ecologically. The function of the vanguard function, as I call it, to differentiate it from this old understanding of the vanguard inherited from Marxism. The vanguard function is the necessary complement to thinking organization as ecology, because what you want precisely in an ecology is people who aren't simply acting out their political identity or their favorite theory of change, but people who are attuned to the struggles that are going on, are attuned to the potential of struggles or the potentials for struggle in different spaces, and looking for what needs to be done. And, asking themselves, well, what is the organization that we need in order to do something here, in order to intervene here, and then making the effort to build that organization and to intervene, be it, doing very local community organizing work, base building work, or, the more flashy, the more showy interventions of the platform logic kind, which, to come back to the points that Richard and Paolo were making earlier, I think can work, and I wish that I'd maybe been clearer about that in the book. I think what we describe as this platform logic of doing politics, which is mostly based online and uses a certain model of organizing as a way of drawing people, I think that can be very useful for the left in terms of producing what you might call a primitive accumulation of activists, i.e. drawing new activists into the movement who are drawn because of that opportunity of working on this particular project or this kind of this mode of action. But really the problem then becomes, as Richard and Cam have pointed out, going beyond that. A movement that's made of only activists is like a fire that's only kindling. It's going to burn and consume itself very quickly if it doesn't develop the capacity to the organizational capacity and the political capacity, the political ability to connect to a much broader social base.
Anyone want to chime in on that?
Can I say something quickly?
Yeah, of course.
So I think there was an important, a few things that are worth connecting with. There was an important point there made about the image of the social movement as something that just, seems to appear from nowhere, a bit like, those giant protests, the big day, as it were. And that, it seems to me, is one of the major impediments to understanding, essentially the logic and exigencies of a social movement. It reminds me a little bit, since Rodrigo invoked the metaphor of fire and blaze, it reminds me of Gaston Bachelard's psychoanalysis of fire, where he points out that historically humans have tried to understand fire as something that is either spiritual or some kind of liquid or something like that, some sort of substance. So either an animistic or a substantialist notion of fire based upon the fact that we couldn't understand that what we were seeing, the palpable confirmations that we were getting from fire, the heat and the light, was in fact just the product of various processual outcomes. And so it is with the sort of the big day of the social movement, whether it's a mass riot in a more militant vein, like with recent Black Lives Matter protests, or whether it's the sort of NGOized big celebrified events with, I don't know, Live 8 or something like that. So I think this comes back to Camille's point about social reproduction, because the question really is, what is a social movement? What do we mean by a social movement? What constitutes it? And I think probably it would be helpful to think of it, the fundamental unit of social movement, as a social relationship in crisis, in a state of antagonism and unsustainable antagonism. And we can then think about how that is ecologically organized, but structured, obviously, by, I mean, from a Marxist point of view, the relation is structured by the mode of production, which is never fully realized, which is always open and complex in generative structure and difference, and therefore gives rise to various overlapping, if you like, structures of meaning, framings, complex ways of life, for example, cooperativism, or on the right, clancraft, as it was called. And various different kinds of territoriality of relations and productions and so on, such that you know, the social movement that appears is something that has already been the product of all of these sort of processes working in a capillary fashion through various geoeconomic frameworks, various cultural frameworks, and so on. And so the question then is, and this comes back to what Paolo said, you know, the question then is, what is the relationship between those who are sort of well-organized militants and those who aren't, those who are sort of on the periphery, but nonetheless make up the majority of people who will sort of attend mass gatherings and so on. And that's why I think it's useful to have a sort of de-essentialized notion of the vanguard function. The only problem is that we still need to have some idea of, I suppose, some sort of sense of I think a hierarchy, a strategic hierarchy, I mean, of useful functions, of particularly if we're thinking about something involving systemic change, that level of transformation. So we need to have some idea of, say, vanguard functions that are not merely contingently more useful at the moment, but which have some sort of long-range strategic purpose. And we need to have some sense of why that is, and to relate that back to the processes of social reproduction that you mentioned. I'll leave it there.
Yes, perhaps I'll pick it up from there. Indeed, also, if we look at leadership more as a process than as an entity, it may help overcome some of the suspicion that is associated with this term in activist circles, because it's really something that refers to initiative, to the process of moving and shaking. Sometimes individualized, sometimes more collective, but it's evident to anybody who has acquaintance with social movements that they don't happen just spontaneously, or I mean, there are always kind of catalytic moments when certain potentia, right, to use a term that Rodrigo uses often in the book, is actualized into actual mobilization, and there often it takes brain fathers, brain mothers of concepts, people who are kind of launching the name of a movement. I mean, the very act of naming a movement, for example, or giving a brand, an image, identity, storytelling to the movement, that is often really the act of leadership in social movements. I mean, think about the person who came up with the idea of Black Lives Matter. Right? It may sound kind of trivial or banal, but sometimes really these very basic things define a movement and shape its course. And often in these pivotal moments of social movements, the action tends to be restricted to few people. It's almost inescapable because of what Weber and Michels describe as Prinzip der kleinen Zahlen, namely the principle of the small numbers, right? Which was one of these exchanges that also Gramsci was influenced by, right, in these debates before the Second World War. And what the Principle of the kleinen Zahlen meant is the higher maneuverability of small groups. Namely, the smaller the group, up to kind of the limit case of one person, the greater the speed of decision and the freedom in deciding. And I think anybody has an experience of that. I mean, I have experiences, for example, in Italian activist meetings where a certain horizontalism has been taken to the extreme, that sometimes people want to launch a movement and they call an assembly to decide the movement's name, which is something that never works because at this point, everybody will have an idea and it will be impossible to reconcile. And if you try to negotiate or mediate or find a compromise on things that are as important and as a movement name, as the movement identity, you always end up with either a kind of very watered down version that doesn't really work, doesn't really click with the public imagination, or you will just end up with a big argument. And also because of this idea that everyone has to be listened, right? If someone makes a creative proposal and that is not taken into account, it may be taken as a personal offense. So I think in this context, it can be seen that there are moments of leadership, there are acts of leadership, and they are performed and they are necessary to the very existence, to the very kind of birth of movements of all kinds, and that doesn't contradict the present then of kind of more participatory moments of more, let's call them horizontal moments, when people can give their contribution, their qualitative contribution to the movement, their ideas. But indeed, I think we should look at all of these in terms of kind of concentric circles, right? Which was an image that already Bakunin, right, was using as he was thinking about the kind of international brotherhood. And namely that all organizations operate in something akin to a kind of electromagnetic field where there are poles of centrality and with kind of space of diffusion around them. And the stronger the movement is, the deeper its field of force is. I mean, the deeper it manages to kind of penetrate in, also in spaces where the level of mobilization is low, but the quantity of people who can be mobilized is potentially high.
Anyone else want to chime in on this? Cool. I would just ask then, Rodrigo dedicates an entire chapter of the book to the analysis of the ways in which the idea of revolution has changed since the 18th century. And one of the elements that he highlights is what he names the hylomorphic tendency in thinking about revolution, particularly the Marxist tradition, within the Marxist problematic of the role of the state, right? By this, he means to say, I think that it was assumed that the problem of transition from a world of exploitation, oppression, and domination to a world of collective liberation could be solved by using state power as an instrument through imposing a form on a population and a natural world that was treated as inherent or as inert, malleable matter. And this obviously coming back to the question of climate change, this is one of the things that I think of when the IPCC has called for a profound revolution of incredible social transformation at breakneck speed, spanning the molar and molecular levels of society, amounting to a revolution in the process of social reproduction in order to bring it back within the metabolic capacities of nature, right? What dangers do we all see in focusing on the state as a weapon against not only fossil capital on the one hand, as like the kind of molar apparatus, but the imperial mode of living as the kind of molecular subterfuge of all that? Does this run the risk of alienating the very populations we need to win over? Does this open a door to fascism? Is this a problem that we cannot go without? This is something that we have to wager on, nonetheless. And I'd like to start perhaps with you, Richard, and then we could open the floor for everyone's contribution.
Okay. Look, I mean, I think the state is an unavoidable terrain of strategic action in the sense if we need revolutionary change in a span of time where we're unlikely to achieve a revolution, then we are stuck with the existing modalities of political power and how do we radically transform them. But to go beyond that, I think we need to clarify what we mean by the state. I mean, I'm obviously partial myself to a Polanskian ontology of the state, in which basically there is no such thing as the state. It's not a thing. It's not a person. It is rather spoken of in the Polanskian idiom as a formed, determined condensation of the balance of class and political forces, which is to say, because it's form determined, it's not just a screenshot of the balance of forces as it stands today, but registers within its institutional materiality the conduct, symbols, and outcomes of historical struggles, such as if you think of how Chartism, suffragism, etc., have transformed the state without breaking its relationship to the capitalist class. So, in other words, if the state is not a thing, if it is like a social movement, a series of processual outcomes, configured in institutions that monopolize various forms of social and political and technical knowledge, as well as violence, and permit a range of policies to be implemented, provided they are drafted in the lexis of the state as it exists today. Strategically, I think this means that if you were, on the one hand, to try to simply elect, let's say, an eco-socialist government committed to radical change, probably what you'd find is it would be swiftly encircled and isolated by hostile apparatuses. And the seamless flow of power would start to reroute around it. The locus of dominance within the state would shift away from, say, the executive or parliament towards apparatuses such as the judiciary. They start ruling out the laws that this government tried to implement. It means that in emergency circumstances, the initiative could be taken by the military or police. This isn't quite the same as the fascist worry that you're talking about, Daniel, but because, you know, we're not talking about a sort of populist insurrection at that point. But Polanski's argued that short of ruptures in the state, you can only ever build resistances, pockets of opposition within the state because of the way that it's formally organized to exclude radical transformation. So if we're talking about dealing with climate change in a timely fashion, ruptures is the key thing here. Now, there's a kind of right-wing Polanskian kind of argument associated with the mainstream of Eurocommunism, which emphasizes the idea that, you know, you've got to build alliances within the state. And, you know, that could involve carefully analyzing the class composition of the state, the splits in personnel, the ideological formation of different layers of different apparatuses, unionization of state workers, gender and sexuality as constituted through the state. And it's true that Polanski's thought that a direct confrontation and encircling of state apparatuses by extra parliamentary forces would be doomed, would be crushed by overwhelming force. I mean, even if today we had a revolutionary party with 100,000 members rooted in a militant working class, short of a catastrophic breakdown of the kind that Russia experienced in 1917, it's quite likely we would not be able to withstand a concentrated attack by the state. However, the point here was not simply a long march through the institutions, rather, and this is where it can become useful, these alliances traversing the state had to begin with direct democratic mobilizations formally out with the state. Formally out with, because of course the distinction between state and non-state is actually a fiction internal to the state. And they had to be prepared, crucially, at crisis points for a rupture, for a sudden break with existing protocols, with the existing institutional configuration, even with assumptions about legality, as the right term displays to us. Law always has a certain amount of indeterminacy about it. And so an example of that might be if Syriza had responded to the Oxy vote in the referendum by withdrawing from the European Union. It would not have been the same thing as the big day of revolution, and it would bring substantial risks of reversal and retrenchment. But you can see how strategically that would reconfigure the terrain of the state in our favor. So I don't think we can refuse this terrain, because if we did, we would leave political power concentrated and organized in ways that favor imperialist, military, securitarian, authoritarian, and austerian iterations of climate politics, new forms of patriarchy based on demographic control, obviously neo-imperialisms based on extractivism for rare materials, rare metals. And from that, crucially, that violent form of imperialist politics with its accompanying strains of sadism, social Darwinism, and race-making, the fascist danger that we're worried about would indeed be catalyzed into being, because, and this is a final clarification I would make in this respect. I mean, I think of fascism really not primarily as not in the first instance as an authoritarian state, but rather I think it has genuine revolutionary dimensions in the national sense. And I don't just mean the aspect of rupture, say the fact that it is able to form alliances with fascized apparatuses of the state in order to take power. I mean that its dialectic of popular mobilization, even after a regime is established, from the riots preceding the Nuremberg laws to the ordinary people who volunteered for the Einsatzgruppen murders, which were part of the Holocaust. I mean that is an ongoing attempt to revolutionize the nation, and obviously drives it towards a catastrophic conclusion. And if we don't traverse the state and force ruptures within it, ruptures that would disperse power and weaken its repressive potentialities, and that would set up a dynamic of perpetual mobilization in ways that favor democratic climate responses, then of course I think fascism will. So that's my summary answer to that.
Anyone want to respond to that? Yeah, I think that just to clarify, I think the specter of fascism, as you said, isn't simply one that's like formalized in the state, but also a kind of, I mean, you see that where like Trump or right-wing forces mobilize a kind of popular unwillingness to change the lifestyle, right? And to hang on to this imperial mode of living as a way of like developing a kind of a molecular network or a kind of aggregate, like, I do not want to change my lifestyle. I want it to stay as is, fuck all, if that means the death of like my children or some shit like that, right? 100%. There is that kind of popular denialism, to put it crudely. But yeah, what do others want to chime in on this?
Well,
I think I agree.
Oh.
You go, Rodrigo, go.
No, I was just going to say that I agree with most of what Richard has said, especially the way he frames the problem in terms of, we can't really, it's a luxury we don't really have in the present circumstances, for sure, and maybe we have never actually had the luxury of simply letting go of the state apparatus, not necessarily because of what we can actually do with the state apparatus, but because of what it will end up doing if we're not trying, at the very least, to jam its workings from the inside as well as from the outside. Obviously, there is something. The slightly curious thing about a question such as this is that obviously we're nowhere near pretty much anywhere in the world at the moment. Maybe no movements are anywhere near being in a position to actually use state power, let alone in the way that that Daniel described. So we're very actually far from building the capacity to have enough leverage over the state apparatus, be it from the inside or from the outside, to push any of those things through. And it's absolutely clear to me, and I think this is something all of us here agree on, that this wouldn't be possible at the point in which there would be enough leverage to force the state apparatus in the direction in which we need it to go, and at anywhere with anything resembling the resoluteness and the capacity to enact true change that we would need it to do in the time that we have. In order to get to that point, we would already need to also have very strong movements on the ground that would be able to do the other side of the work, the side of simply obstructing the expansion of commodification and extractivism. The kinds of local alternatives that would be able to progressively disconnect from the long logistical chains of capitalism and create different incentive structures for people locally so that they could progressively dissociate their own social reproduction from the reproduction of capital. So obviously, in a sense, when we talk about, should we use the commanding heights of state power to fight climate change, there's an element of fantasy in that, because we're nowhere near the commanding heights of state power. And in order to get there, we would almost definitely, in order to get there in such a way that, this wasn't just an isolated electoral victory that could be overturned in all sorts of different ways shortly afterwards, like it happened with Syriza, we would need to have the ecology that could precisely do all the other things you would need to do alongside and beyond state power in order to act on climate change. But I think what Daniel's question is hinting at is two other things as well. One, the problem of interest formation, and especially if we think about workers or generally citizens of the countries that benefit the most from imperial arrangements of trade and political power, and therefore those people who suffer the least impact from extractivism, from the expansion of the extractivist frontier, and from the mounting effects of climate change, but also those people who, in some sense, would stand the most to lose from a shift, because they would possibly be the ones whose lifestyles would have to transform in the most dramatic ways. And this opens onto a second problem that had been out of the agenda of the left for a while, since certainly, well, I guess you could say since the fall of the Berlin Wall, and certainly around the turn of the century, which is the question of hegemony, which is the question of, well, how do you act on interest formation in such a way as to bring people, even people who stand something to lose from acting on climate change. In this case, how do you bring these people along? And I guess this is the biggest challenge. Certainly, I think the biggest challenge in the global north. Also, obviously, a challenge in the global south, because a lot of the people you would need to move politically are people who still benefit in their own way from the arrangements of the carbon-based economy that we have today. And yeah, this is, I guess, I wish I had a clear answer to that. I think, sadly, I don't. But I think what we can say is, at the end of the day, people will be moved on climate change. Not that many people will be moved on climate change because of climate change. People, at least the evidence that we have to this day, is that people are moved for all sorts of different reasons, and for reasons that affect their social reproduction, their livelihoods in all sorts of different ways. And the political effort to build the kinds of alliances that put you in a position to not only use whatever leverage you can have over the state apparatus, but also to do all the other sorts of political work that needs to be done in order to produce action on climate change. Those alliances have to be built from there, have to be built from the stuff that already matters to people, and connecting that to climate change, connecting that to putting an end to the carbon economy, and in the process, hopefully putting an end to capitalism as well.
I can jump in a little here, I think. So I really agree that we obviously cannot ignore the state. To paraphrase a poster from the student union that I cut my teeth in, you might not be interested in the state, but the state is really interested in you. But I wanted to pick up on some of these questions in relation to climate change that people have been kind of drilling down onto. And I really agree with what Richard was talking about in terms of what are we talking about when we mean by the state? Is it in any way useful to continue to this kind of fiction that the state is just the legislative kind of aspect? And I think that we can see that in relation to this question around the absolute necessity to keep global heating under 1.5 degrees. because in the kind of conceptualization of like kind of state power at the moment, if we were to have all of the promises delivered that we kind of hear about from various state leaders, we're on track for 2.4 degrees of warming. And so that at the moment is kind of like the best case scenario that the state is kind of throwing up. And for those who don't know, in the kind of shorthand around what the differences between 1.5 and 2.4 kind of look like, life is pretty difficult and is going to require a hell of a lot of adapting and also mitigation at 1.5. And at 2.4, we kind of start to get into some of the kind of catastrophic kind of levels of kind of transformation of our ecological and political and social worlds. So what I've been thinking about, and I agreed with Rodrigo's articulation then, that in many ways we can think of climate change in a simple way, and it's not actually very useful to think about it in the ways that it's kind of currently being cast in these kind of temperatures or parts per million of carbon. And it's much more useful for this question around what role do we see for the state and what role do we see for political organization and social forces outside of what we might understand as state politics. And I think this, like these two twin tracks of kind of commodification and extractivism are really useful ways of thinking about how to act and also to what social forces currently exist and what levers and processes of organization can we think of that would help us move along those kind of two questions and those two terrains of struggles and forms of conflict. Because I think at the moment we run an incredible risk of potentially moving away from fossil fuel dependency, but continuing with the kind of colonial and imperialist understanding of resource allocation and resource management. At the moment, the green future fundamentally relies on the continued kind of exploitation, violence, and oppression of the global south. And I think that reality at a really fundamental level requires us to rethink the question of commodification and of this question around interests that Rodrigo was talking about. One of the things that I think shifted and changed since the late 90s, definitely, in terms of this little nostalgic trip that I've been down today, thinking about this kind of history of movements, is that I think that we are getting to the point of being able to destabilize some of the previous hegemonic kind of ideas around growth and around development, and that certainly that's a welcome addition when we're starting to think about the new forms of social contract that I think that we're going to have to negotiate in this coming period. Because I agree that the time frame that we have available to us to create the kinds of changes that are necessary to confront the ecological catastrophe that is already upon us, I think it's a really important shift in our political horizons to understand that the climate emergency is well underway, and that it is precisely our global location in that crisis that means that we don't feel it in the same way as a huge amount, millions of people are already experiencing it. But in terms of this new social contract, and I think for social movements in the global north, thinking about interest, we have to be able to articulate what people gain from reconfiguring life outside of kind of fossil fuel extraction, because the idea that we lose, I think that kind of binary doesn't help us come to new kind of thinking of new political kind of horizons and new political figures, and kind of who are the agents and catalysts of change that will be able to bring about the kind of global reconfiguration of life, basically. Because I think that for the up until, probably 2019, where I would say that the Overton window around climate change fundamentally shifted as a result of mass movements in a variety of different ways that obviously stood on the shoulders of decades and centuries of activism from Indigenous and frontline communities. I think that one of the important things that we're seeing, I totally lost my train of thought. Lol. So in terms of what I think we're seeing and what I think what's absolutely necessary at this point is to be able to articulate that not everything stays the same. It's not just that we move to green energy and a kind of nicer, fairer way of allocating resources. I think that the exciting potential of what this potentially really catastrophic kind of problem presents for us is a reshaping of the terms of the debate around what is a good life and what role work and capital plays in that. So over and out.
Yes, I think that perhaps we should frame the question not as a matter of choice, but more as a matter of necessity, in a sense that one of the trends of contemporary politics is what could be described as a neo-statism, in a sense of a return of the interventionist state, not just on the left, but really in political debates as a whole. That is being facilitated by the coronavirus crisis, obviously. I mean, as there's been a moment of realization, people realize that when you're in real trouble, you go to the market for solutions, and the market has no solutions. You need masks, and the market is not able even to provide basic means as masks. And with vaccinations, we have seen similar things happening, and people have also realized how important public services are for their social reproduction, precisely. And this is something that perhaps is the most important silver lining of the coronavirus pandemic, in a way, that the celebration of care workers as heroes and of public health system as a monument, right, to human ingenuity and solidarity. So in this context, we know that the state is a capitalist state, obviously, as we know from Polanczas, that it is there, the present model of state, to a great extent, to maintain capitalist relations of production. We've seen how much money has gone into subsidizing companies, into subsidizing private actors, and we see more of that as in the coming years we are probably bound to see banks going bankrupt and the state being there prepared to help them. But I think there is also an important potential there, in the sense that we also know that many solutions need to be found also through the state. I think for people like us, like me, Camille, Rodrigo, and I think also Richard, I mean, we have witnessed how much of the anti-globalization rhetoric about organization was framed on the premise of a withering away of the state and a withering away of the nation. I think we can agree that didn't happen. I mean, the nation state has been weakened in many respects, but still remains a key center of authority and legitimacy, right? And I think these two things have too often been ignored at our expenses. We see also return of interventionist state in a sense of more protectionism, right? I think that what is really interesting in the change in US strategy on economic policy is an internalization of the fact that China is a state capitalist system. And therefore, the US cannot go on acting as if we were in a free market. And therefore, as Brian Deese, the head of the National Economic Council of Joe Biden, says in recent interviews, in a way, even the United States, namely the kind of the country that was identified with free markets and globalization and so on and so forth, is adopting policies that make it more similar to China, right? Responding to the Chinese challenge by, in a way, mimicking China. For example, adopting more protectionist policies, adopting Buy American procurement policies. Right? So this is something that is going to happen anyway, let's say, regardless of our wishes or our ideological viewpoint. The question is how socialists can intervene in these and use the state as a pressure point, as social movements have done in the past, to exact concessions in the favor of workers and citizens. And there are all a series of battles to be fought over basic also social democratic demands. I mean, raising the minimum wage, right? That in fact is precisely the Biden's promise that didn't make it through due to opposition of neoliberal Democrats in the Senate, and a strengthening of public services, but also a fundamental thing, and I'd like to end on this, is state ownership, right? Because the new progressive liberalism, right, that is emerging in the Biden administration, which is quite different from the neoliberalism of the Clinton and Obama era, still it is a liberalism, but quite a different kind, doesn't contemplate any state ownership, not even the state ownership of the Tennessee Valley Authority in Roosevelt time. I mean, they absolutely don't want the state to own things. While that is precisely the thing that socialists should fight for, in the sense that there will not be any real challenging of inequality and any real challenging of the lack of democracy in present society unless we regain control and also ownership of strategic companies that have a very important influence on economic decisions that affect the citizenry and affect workers. And that also carries important questions for organizations, because in a way, these pressure points of the state allow organizations to develop strategies that are focused on achievable goals and that can provide movements with the necessary kind of center of gravity to concentrate their energies around.
I want to ask a final question to the group, and it's really short. And I want to ask: does it still help us? Does the concept of revolution still help us think through politics, or does it limit us? And I'd like to begin with Rodrigo, specifically around this problem of climate change, right?
Well, that's actually the note on which I close the book. It's because I raised the problem earlier, that based on a line from Lukács, where he says that the question of organization, or a theory of organization, must be worked out from a theory of revolution. And I raised this question, but then I never try to offer an answer to it until the very end of the book, where I say, well, you might have noticed that I was dodging this question until now. So is there a theory of revolution that I'm assuming here? And if there is, what is it? And what I propose is, in the last few years, we've had these two parallel developments, which are quite ironic. On the one hand, in a lot of political, everyday political discourse, thanks to the capacity of movements to put those sorts of questions in the agenda, the word transition has been popping up more and more. Obviously, usually when people talk about transition, what they have in mind is a transition away from the carbon economy. On the other hand, parallel to that, in recent years, we've had, mostly because of the influence of communization theory, there's been a lot of discussion around the idea of transition, where transition ends up being framed as the enemy. But obviously, what transition means in this sense is something else entirely. Transition in these debates refers to the idea of transition, or a transitional state, a transitional society between capitalism and communism, i.e., the problem that every actually existing socialist state was supposed to be both posing and the solution to at the same time, but all of them, I think it's safe to say, failed quite miserably at answering. And so we have from communization theory this argument that, you know, we should reject the idea of transition in that sense entirely. And, you know, while I think there's a lot to be learned from those arguments, it's clear to me that once you step out of Marxist debates, it's sort of obvious that in conceptual terms, transition has a greater extension as a concept than revolution. I think it makes a lot more sense to think or to ask oneself whether revolution is part of a process of transitioning from one kind of condition to another, than to ask yourself whether a transition is a necessary part of a revolution. So basically, I think we should hold on to the idea of revolution, and we should hold on to the idea to the extent precisely that it gives us some kind of, it gives us a compass. It gives us an orientation of what the maximal extension of what we're trying to do is, if we understand revolution in the ultimately maximal meaning of, you know, a transformation of an entire global system. So the idea is definitely useful still as a compass and a correction to a tendency which Paulo just alluded to in his answer, to kind of at once metaphorically extend the concept of revolution so that it could apply to more or less anything, but on the other hand, to sweep the problem of revolution under the rug, to try and think that, well, the state is going to wither away. It's already withering away anyway, and it's going to continue to wither away, so we don't have to worry about that. And it may just be, as I said at the start, this conditional belief that it may just be that if we keep on acting at the scale in which we're acting, we'll eventually get somewhere else entirely, which are obviously mechanisms that allow us not to pose the problem of organizing to act at certain scales, or to, you know, trying to posing the problem of, you know, gaining some kind of leverage over the state, etc. All of which were problems that people evidently had an interest in abandoning or sweeping under the rug because of all the traumas historically associated with these ideas. And, you know, we belong, not Daniel, obviously, it wasn't even born, but the rest of us here, we belong to the first generation to come of age politically after the fall of the Berlin Wall. So what would it mean to replace revolution, or to invert the order of things, and instead of posing transition as a part of revolution or not, asking yourself, well, does revolution have a part to play in transition? That connects to something that Richard was saying, which is and that all of us have touched on to some extent, which is the temporal problem that is posed by transition. To put it in very schematic terms, you have to move in a transition to something else, to a different state of affairs. You have to move fast enough that you can't be reabsorbed back into the state of affairs that you're trying to get out of, that you can't be recuperated by capital, by the state, etc. But you cannot go so far as to risk social disruption to such an extreme level that the blowback would be almost inevitable, and you would risk the resurrection of perhaps even worse forms, worse kinds of state formations or relations of production. And here I think Cam's addendum to what I was saying on interest formation is really important, because I think we generally have a tendency on the left to think of interest formation, to think of the way in which other people form their interests by analogy with us, with people on the left. And so the model that we tend to think ourselves according to is this very rarefied, which may absolutely not be true, but it's part of the stories that we tell about ourselves. This rarefied model of disinterestedness, this capacity to, oh yes, I recognize that I have all these interests, but I make a decision to let go. And that's not even true of us. That's not true of anyone, I would say. Interests are always, there is no such thing as disinterest. Interests are replaced by different interests. And the problem is, on the one hand, how do you respond to a crisis of social reproduction by going fast enough that you can't be recuperated, but not so fast that you would risk causing a crisis of social reproduction that's even more extreme? But on the other hand, how do you replace the interests that people would be losing on with other interests that people would be gaining on in the process? And Cam is absolutely right to say that there's a limit to posing things purely in terms of what people would stand to lose from action on climate change. We need to talk about what are the things that people would gain. So this idea of placing revolution as part of transition rather than the other way around places revolution as the ruptures that allow you to accelerate this process of transformation, which could not possibly, and will not, if we can pull it off at all, work in a linear way. It's necessary precisely that it moves in non-linear ways, that it has the capacity to accelerate at critical junctures to prevent recuperation by capital and the state. So this idea ultimately involves resurrecting another idea that first came up in the cycle of struggles of the anti-globalization movement, which was diversity of tactics, but taking this to a different level, I believe, to a level of diversity of strategies. to a level of, and I think Richard posed the question very well when he talked about a hierarchy of vanguard functions. You can think of people who are taking initiative that's purely responding to what happened yesterday, and that's valuable, but we need to build the capacity to think and gather our collective capacity to act, to work at much longer timescales, strategically speaking. And it would, I believe, involve a combination of three kinds of action that I alluded to before. Obstruction, which is, stopping the expansion of commodification and extractivism. Disconnection, which is basically coming up with ways to dissociate the social reproduction of people from the reproduction of capital, and particularly from the reproduction of capital as it exists today, depending on the completely unsustainable logistical chains that it depends on today. And finally, refunctioning certain pieces of infrastructure and institutions that can be put to different users. Now, how to disconnect is something to be discovered through experimentation. And finally, what to refunction is, I think, an empirical question that we need to pose ourselves along the way, rather than trying to find an a priori answer for it now.
I can jump in there so that we don't have too much awkward silences. So this question of, is revolution still relevant? Bloody well hope so, because I've been calling myself a revolutionary for 22 years now, so don't really want to be out of date. And I think that Rodrigo's point around transition is one that really sharpens this question for me. I think we have to acknowledge that we are at this particular juncture living through a transformation and a transition. And the question I think that we need to pose to our political organizations and to our movements is, we have to be able to intervene into this transition, because where we're currently going is, I think it's pretty clear, into a pretty, like, if the current forces of capital are able to dictate this transition away from fossil fuels and what their pivot will be, is one that, first of all, is not sufficient to address the crisis that we face, and at the same time is one in which levels of authoritarianism and violence and exploitation are maintained and actually massively increased. Because I think there's a resolution. I think we need to be really clear that there are resolutions to the climate crisis we need to be careful with this kind of, we're all in this together kind of mantra. Whilst, obviously we're all a part of the same storm, we're definitely not all in the same boat. And that there are ways of configuring access to water and access to other resources that I think that some people have, obviously, militants and leftists and activists have a good understanding of some of the hierarchies that currently exist, but I don't think we've even really gotten started yet in terms of the politics of kind of abandonment and the politics of lifeboat politics, of kind of pulling up the rafts and quite figuratively and literally allowing other people to drown. So in terms of this question around revolution and how useful it is to us, I think for me, it comes down to questions of what demands are useful, like what are these concessions, and that we have to aim so far ahead of where we're currently articulating. And I suppose for me, as long as we don't consider the revolution as an event that's going to happen on one day, and that we instead insist on the kind of messiness and the process and the, the destination definitely matters, but obviously also the journey there. And so as long as this specter or this fear of revolution or of the necessity to be revolutionary in this period is one that embraces a messiness and a complexity, and circling all the way back to one that nurtures and supports and leans into an ecology of forces, as opposed to a conceptualization of revolution that is seeking a kind of purity of politics, then I think it remains useful for us, if nothing else, because it raises the ambition of what is required, and it points us to different horizons. And I think in that way, it speaks to the kind of scale. It does a lot of heavy lifting in terms of being able to convince people of the scale of change that we need. And also, I think, points people to, I start to see a lot more of this articulation of that we need systemic change, or we need structural change. And I'm, for better or worse, working back within the NGO industrial complex at the moment. And I see people who could, for all intensive purposes, only be understood as radical social democrats talking about structural and systemic change all the time. And I think that it's really important to kind of push at these moments, because what are people actually talking about? In most instances, they're focused really heavily on policy, and there's nothing like the climate crisis to really show us just how much we need to be much more clear on the kinds of things that we need to see changed. And I think that there have been other moments in our history, and certainly in the development of capital, where we could talk about transitionary periods. The transition from feudalism to capital is often talked of as a transition. And I think the work of Silvia Federici and George Kafantzis and the kind of autonomous tradition has really sharpened our understanding that transitions of the magnitude that is required and is also underway in our particular epoch, whilst we might look back on them as transitions, actually are incredibly bloody and are violent, and are a set of class kind of forces come to bear on what happens. And I think in that way, I think the sphere or the promise of revolution is really useful for sharpening kind of debates within the movement. And also, I think we have to balance a degree of relationship to the new world that is required, and some of the previous ways in which we used to organize ourselves. And take an instance of food production, that there are old knowledges or traditional knowledges or previous knowledges that have been suppressed or driven out of town or not been allowed to exist. And so I think that part of a contemporary and updated version of what it means to be revolutionary is to also acknowledge what of the past we need to take with us, given the level of change that we are going to demand from people in ostensibly the global north. And that's a really difficult conversation, right? Like, everyone doesn't get to just hold on to their iPads and their meaningful middle-class work and their pret. And I think, coming back to something that Paolo was talking about, I think that the timing of the global pandemic in some ways has been incredibly useful for us, because I think it's been a revolutionary period in some ways over the last year, in terms of the way in which the pandemic has operated to make that which has been structurally invisible visible, and that we as the left, I think, have really been lacking in our ability to make good on that on what that visibility can and should have done for us in terms of the heavy lifting of being able to explain to people and work with people and organize with people around some of the key conflicts over the last 14 months. Those key conflicts are the same key conflicts, I would say, that present themselves in a politics around climate change. And that fundamentally, I think one of the biggest shifts in terms of a revolutionary idea around work is about reconnecting workers to a sense of what their labor produces and their role within a global political economy, and refinding our power, basically, and that power isn't just industrial, it's also outside of the wage, but the relationship between those two. And that we very much have the ability, both through knowledges from Indigenous and frontline communities in the Global South who are fundamentally and intimately involved in the extraction industry and also our global food production, as well as a role of workers in the Global North to bring things to a standstill pretty much immediately. Like, climate change is totally within our grasp to confront and to adapt to and to mitigate against. And so for me, a revolutionary approach to that is about hope, and about where we find hope and what kinds of hope we need at this particular juncture. And for me, that hope doesn't lie in pressing the magic state button around policy, but about instilling and nurturing and working with the actual revolutionary potential of the global proletariat. Thanks.
Thank you so much for that, Camille. Anyone else want to jump in on this? Please keep it hopeful as a parent in the crisis. Do not doom on this right now, please.
Perhaps quickly on that, I think I'm very, I have an internal struggle when it comes to the question of revolution, because I think for a long time it has become a bit of a fetish, right, on the left, and it has become a bit like the Sorelian myth, right, of the general strike that one day will come and will solve all contradictions. Is really, the most teleological element in our imaginary, right? Is in a way the imaginary of the Hegelian end of history, right? This revolution at some point will come and we will redeem all our effort, everything that we did. While in fact the case is that revolutionary events proper are quite rare in history, and then they are followed, right, by phases in between them, where things happen, right? It's not that only revolutions are the only events in history. But I think what is really crucial there is understanding the process of revolution as a process of foundation, of constitution of a new order. I think that is perhaps the bit that often is not sufficiently developed in our imaginary. Namely, it's not just a process of destruction, it's not just a negative moment of doing away with the old regime or doing away with the old order, but the most tricky bit of any revolutionary process or of any kind of radical process of social transformation is constituting a new order, right? A new structure. An order is a term that is looked at with suspicion, especially from a kind of circles we come from. But in fact, as already kind of Gramsci underlined, what socialism is about is creating a new order, a more just order. Also because ultimately order is what people want. Only the most, I would say, idealistic revolutionary can think that revolution per se is a sort of exhilarating or electrifying experience. Actually, as I could witness personally in Egypt around 2011, for most people, revolution means greater difficulty in attending basic daily needs. And while many ordinary people may sympathize with the revolution at the outset because they are very discontent with the existing order, they are also likely to turn to reaction if the revolutionary quickly enough, right? So that means that organization is also about constructing, right? And is also about institution building, right? Is also about, besides doing away with the institutions we don't like, really kind of creating new forms of order, new forms of institutionality that are going to provide society with coordination, provide society with legitimacy, provide society with structures that can attend to all the different issues, right, from climate change to inequality that we have discussed during this debate.
Thank you so much, Paolo. Anyone else?
Yeah, briefly. I mean, I agree with what Paolo just said in terms of the danger of revolution becoming a fetish. Obviously, I was a member of a Trotskyist organization where essentially the image of revolution sort of sutured an overly, if you like, rationalized view of politics, you know, in which one never confronted the dimensions, you know, let's say the dimensions of the unconscious, of sexuality as it played out within the organizational context. And of course, that exploded quite dramatically, as it has repeatedly done in a number of Trotskyist or similar types of organization. And so I think that this image of the revolution has been a way of a form of organizational identity for many people, which is not, for me, a reason to get rid of the notion of revolution. Rather, I think once it's been despiritualized, I think it would be useful to think about how to re-spiritualize it. For example, Paolo talks about the teleological aspect of revolution. I think there's an element of truth to that, in as much as it's tangled up with, historically, with an ideological notion of evolution, in which it is supposedly heading towards perpetual progress of the species through survival of the fittest. And that has all sorts of problematic connotations. But actually, I think really what we're talking about here is something more eschatological. It's millenarian. Rather than just teleological. It is linked to theological expectancy and prophetic desire, as Hart and Negri put it. And I think that that's possibly quite a valid axis on which to pose this question, because if we're talking about climate change and really getting to grips with it, yes, it's important that we don't just talk about everything that's going to have to be given up and everything that's going to have to be lost, because that implies that the lives that we have now are thoroughly satisfying. So obviously, there's a whole question of what is the good life and how could that be lived, and that the implications of that, when you think about what's going to have to change, we're going to have to discover new forms of plenitude, which are not predicated on stuffing shops filled with, you know, mass-produced commodities. We're going to have to find a radically new relationship to food, and therefore to taste, to leisure, all of this sort of stuff. So this is a transformation that goes from the sort of meta stuff, the big stuff about, you know, social relations, social property relations, relations of production, all of that stuff, which Marxists are very, very happy with, because at that level, if you're talking about that, you're not in danger of moralizing at anybody. You're not in danger of coercing anybody and telling them off for not recycling enough and all of that stuff. But the problem is, of course, any actual transformation is going to involve a transition that is deeper than any revolution that we've hitherto experienced, deeper than the Renaissance, deeper than the Enlightenment or the scientific revolution. It's a fundamental transformation of the species. And I wonder if revolution is really an adequate term for that. I suppose the religious term great work might apply. But something like that, something that implies a mass engagement in creative transitioning. But this brings me back to what I said earlier, the danger of any kind of politics of thin civic engagement and thin civic association is that it simply won't be adequate to the emergency that we face. If we were really taking it seriously, I've said this before, we would be having town meetings in every, town hall meetings in every village and city and town every week to figure out what the hell we're going to do. And that would be a global planetary engagement. So that entails a shift, not just to scale a shift, but a qualitative shift in how we've approached organizing and in how we've approached priorities. I don't even know where to begin with that. Revolution seems a reasonable sort of starting point, but it just doesn't describe the scale or the depth of the transition that we're going to have to face.
Well, that was great, everyone. I'm going to close it at that. Thanks a lot for those last words, Richard. Thanks to everyone that participated on this panel. It was all very insightful. I've written a number of time markers in order to use for future reference. Thank you all. Really, really great work. And Rodrigo, thank you for writing a brilliant work that we will all be talking about for some time, hopefully. Yeah, and thanks to the comrades at Red May for this wonderful infrastructure. I leave it at that, team. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good Sunday.